Welcome to this lecture on how AI impacts retractions of scientific publications. In our previous lecture, we followed the life of scientific knowledge after publication. We explored how research is spread through society, how retractions continue attracting attention, and how retractions become part of the scientific conversation. Now we are moving one step earlier in that story. Before a paper is discussed, cited, or retracted, it first has to be written, reviewed, and published. Today, artificial intelligence is transforming every one of those stages. In this lecture, we'll explore how AI is changing scientific publishing, why AI-related retractions are increasing, and why maintaining trust in science ultimately depends on human responsibility rather than technology itself. When people hear about AI-related retractions, they often imagine an entirely new form of scientific misconduct. In reality, AI has not created an entirely new category of misconduct. Instead, it has made many existing problems easier, faster, and cheaper to produce. Researchers already knew about fabricated data, fake and compromised peer review, plagiarism, and paper mills long before modern generative AI. What AI changes the scale. If AI is accelerating existing problems rather than creating completely new ones, can we already see this reflected in retraction data? The answer is yes, but the numbers require careful interpretation. This figure shows retractions associated with computer-aided content or computer-generated content over time, using data from Retraction Watch database. One pattern is immediately visible. Following the widespread availability of modern generative AI tools, particularly after the release of ChatGPT in late 2022, AI-related retractions became much more common. However, it is important to remember that these numbers actually represent detected, investigated, and formally retracted cases. They do not represent every instance in which AI may have been used inappropriately. Many problematic papers may never be detected, and others may still be under investigation. So the figures should be interpreted as a minimum estimate rather than a complete picture. But what exactly do we mean by an AI-related retraction? That phrase actually covers many different situations. There is no single type of AI-related retraction. Instead, AI can leave traces at many different stages of the research and publishing process. Let's begin with the most direct and easiest forms of recognizing cases where journals explicitly identify computer-generated. Occasional retraction notices state the reason quite explicitly. Some notices conclude that there is a clear evidence the manuscript or parts of it were generated by a computer. Others focus on transparency. For example, a journal may determine that substantial text was produced using a large language model without the disclosure required by its editorial policy. But explicit statements like these are actually relatively uncommon. More often, AI reveals itself indirectly through the kinds of mistakes it leaves behind. One reason AI-generated content can be difficult to detect is that it often reads very well. The grammar is usually correct, the sentences are fluent, the structure looks professional. At first glance, everything appears convincing, but scientific writing is not judged by grammar alone. It must communicate clear ideas, appropriate method, logical argument, and conclusion. Sometimes AI-generated text does something quite different. Editors sometimes describe these papers using phrases such as meaningless wording, non-standard language, or sections unrelated to paper's topic. So as AI becomes better at writing, good language is no longer enough. We must evaluate whether the science itself makes sense. Let's look at a deliberately exaggerated example. Imagine opening a paper claiming that the walking speed of the emperor penguin predicts global inflation with 97% accuracy. This humorous example illustrates LLMs do not automatically understand whether hypotheses are meaningful. That responsibility belongs to researchers, reviewers, and editors. Sometimes writing problem becomes even more obvious through tortured phrases. Imagine reading a paper that repeatedly refers to counterfeit consciousness instead of artificial intelligence. It sounds unusual, but this phenomenon has become genuine concern in scientific publishing. These so-called torture phrases are awkward substitutes for familiar scientific terms. Torture phrases are rarely the problem themselves. They are often the first clue that something else may be wrong in the paper too. Researchers have recently begun studying tortured phrases systematically across different academic disciplines. Here you see examples of humanities and social science. The phrases and initials clearly do not match in the tortured phrases. Next place AI can introduce error is references. One of the best known limitations of artificial intelligence is the tendency to hallucinate. That is to generate information that sounds convincing but is not actually true. An AI system may invent references that do not exist or describe experiments that were never performed, misrepresent previous studies, or even generate unsupported conclusions that appear entirely plausible to a reader that does not know anything about the subject. This is why human verification remains essential, and there are diverse sets of retractions that originate from this. The more fluent AI becomes, the less we can judge scientific reliability by writing quality alone. A polished manuscript is not necessarily a trustworthy manuscript anymore. Imagine reading a paper that cites 20 highly relevant studies. Only later you discover that several of those papers never existed. This phenomenon is known as citation hallucination, and it has become one of the most widely discussed risks associated with generative AI. LLMs can produce references that appear completely authentic while inventing authors, titles, publication year, and even entire journals. The retraction danger is obvious. Researchers have now begun measuring how often these hallucinated citations occur. Recent large-scale studies in preprint repositories like Archive, SSRN, and PubMed show that citation hallucination in literature is increasing substantially and are not distributed evenly across scientific disciplines. Social science experiences higher hallucination rate than others. In medical sciences, with enormous publication volume, naturally there are larger absolute number of fabricated citations. The important message, however, is not which discipline performs better or worse. The important message is that every discipline is potentially affected. Whether you work in medicine, engineering, computer science, economics, or humanities, references generated with AI should always be checked against reliable bibliographic databases. Responsible use of AI begins with responsible verification. Let's move beyond text and references to another essential part of scientific communication, which are figures. Scientific images have always played an important role in communicating evidence. In the past, image manipulation usually involved editing an existing image, for example, copying, cropping, or altering parts of a figure using photo editing software. Today, generative AI introduces a different possibility. Instead of modifying a real image, it can create an entirely new one that appears scientifically plausible. This presents a significant challenge for journals and reviewers. A fabricated image may look realistic enough to escape visual inspection. This is why scientific integrity increasingly depends on researchers providing access to original image files, metadata, laboratory records, and transparent documentation showing how figures were created. Fabricated data are more serious. Data sets may appear convincing, but convincing is not the same as authentic. This is why many retraction notices no longer focus only on individual errors. Instead, they state something much broader. For instance, the journal no longer has confidence in the results and conclusions. Without trustworthy data, even the most elegant manuscript loses its scientific value. One increasingly common reason underlying retractions involves something called missing provenance. Provenance simply means knowing where scientific evidence came from and being able to reconstruct how it was produced. When journals investigate suspicious papers, they often ask the author to provide the original dataset, the raw images, a record of how analysis was performed, or an independent reproduction of the workflow. Good science is no longer judged only by the final publication, it's also judged by the transparency of the path taken producing it. Perhaps the clearest example of AI changing scientific publishing is the growth of paper mills. Paper mills are organizations that produce and sell fraudulent scientific manuscripts, often on a large commercial scale. And long before generative AI, these organizations already existed. But AI has dramatically lowered the cost of and increased the speed of producing convincing looking papers. Artificial intelligence is increasingly being used during peer review. In many situations, this can be beneficial. Reviewers may use AI to improve the clarity of their writing, organize comments, or check grammar. However, problem arises when AI replaces independent expert evaluation rather than supporting it, and editors need to step in these types of cases and retract publication. Imagine a reviewer uploading confidential manuscript onto an external AI system without permission, or an editor relying primarily on automatically generated recommendations instead of careful assessment of manuscript. Peer review works because qualified experts accept responsibility for their evaluation. AI can assist that process, it cannot assume responsibility for it. So that is one of the reasons that compromised peer review is increasing in number currently. Throughout this lecture, we have looked at many examples of error-related retractions. You may have noticed an interesting pattern. Retraction notices rarely state simply this paper was retracted because of the author used AI. Instead, AI is usually identified indirectly through the evidence it leaves behind. In other words, journals are rarely evaluating AI itself, they are evaluating the quality, transparency, and reliability of the scientific work. AI changes many aspects of how research is produced, but it doesn't change the fundamental principles of science. Evidence still matters, reproducibility still matters, and scientific responsibility still belongs to people. That brings us to the most important message of this lecture. Let's return to the question we asked at the beginning. How is artificial intelligence changing scientific publishing? The answer is both encouraging and cautionary. AI is already helping researchers become more productive. It can improve writing, assist with coding, accelerate literature review, and support many routines in research. If it is used responsibly, these tools have enormous potential. But at the same time, AI can also generate convincing error, fabricated references, synthetic figures, and misleading content at a scale that was previously not possible. The technology itself is neither honest nor dishonest. It simply produces outputs. The responsibility for those outputs remain entirely human. That is why the most important safeguard in scientific publishing is not a software tool, an algorithm, or an AI detector. It is a culture of research integrity. Researchers who verify every claim before publications, reviewers who evaluate ideas critically, and editors who insist on transparency and reproducibility, and institutions that reward quality rather than quantity. When these responsibilities are taken seriously, then AI might be the powerful assistant there. Science is not defined by never making mistakes. Science is defined by its willingness to discover mistakes, correct them openly, and continually improve. Artificial intelligence may change how we conduct research today, but trust in science will always depend on something deeply human: our commitment to honesty, transparency, critical thinking, and accountability. Thank you for joining this course, and I hope these lectures encourage you to use both scientific evidence and artificial intelligence thoughtfully, responsibly, and with integrity.